Hello. In this recording or video, we're going to talk about the first part of chapter 21, which is called Colliding Worlds. Now, before we actually start, I'd like to make sure everyone's ready. And by ready, I would encourage you to have a set of key terms. Let me get them in front of you there, right there. Right? So I would recommend anytime you read or listen to lectures, you have the key terms handy so that you'll be able to identify and write down things about the terms that are most likely to be on quizzes and tests. Also, I think that if you had a copy of the chapter itself, well, let me try and get that in front of there. Okay, that would be very helpful, and you can follow along with the lecture and highlight things as we go through it, or maybe just come back to it later. All right. The title of the chapter is called Colliding Worlds, and I think the author makes a point that this was the European encounter with the Native Americans in the Americas, and later with the indigenous people in Oceania, was a very violent and disruptive event or phenomenon, and that the use of the word collision is really meant to help you remember and reflect on how destructive and transformative this encounter was. Now, going back to the chapter again, I'd like to point out that at the top of each chapter, it gives you the various sections. And the first section, well, it's actually called Colliding Worlds, and it's broken down into 4 different sections. We'll talk about each one briefly. Before we get to that particular section, though, at the start is the eyewitness story that is at the beginning of every chapter, and those are mainly meant to kind of help interest you by providing an account about a specific person or event that the author thinks is significant and reflects something about the general themes of the chapter. And if you notice, this one talks about the mysterious identity of Donna Marina. And if you have your key terms with you, you'll notice that Donna Marina is right there at the top of the list, so that we need to know something about her. And I'm not going to go into great detail because you have the chapter right there in front of you, or you can get it very easily. But there are 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs that talk about Donna Marina, and in essence it points out that she was very important in helping Cortez conquer the Aztecs because she served as an interpreter. That's sort of in the second paragraph. Third paragraph talks about, besides just interpreting, she often provided him with what the book calls intelligence, or information about what the natives were likely to do based on what she had heard them talking about. And then the fourth paragraph about her talks about how she actually had a relationship with Cortez. They had a child, and then later on she married another Spanish conquistador and had children with him, and that this mixing of European and Native American people, the product of that are called mestizos. Again, that's in parentheses in the set of key terms right next to Donna Marina's name. And again, going back to the list, if you scroll down, it shows up later on about 2/3 of the way through. So mestizos is going to be a very important term or concept to remember, and that it essentially deals with the mixing and intermingling of European and Native Americans, and of course their respective cultures. All right, after talking about Donna Marina, the rest of that introductory section talks about some of the major themes in the chapter to come. And again, it kind of harks back to the idea of how disruptive this was, especially for the Native Americans, who were conquered by the Europeans and whose societies were essentially either undermined or overthrown and destroyed. And the rest of the first section talks about some of the reasons why that was able to happen. Okay, getting into that first section called Colliding Worlds, like to point out again that here at the start of that chapter or section, Colliding Worlds, there's essentially one paragraph which outlines some of the major themes in that particular section. So again, just kind of remember that the introduction to the chapter talks about main themes throughout the whole chapter. Each section is going to have its own introduction, which does the same thing for that smaller section. All right. First up in this section is what's called the Spanish Caribbean or Caribbean. We're not going to worry too much about pronunciation as long as you can recognize it. And this subsection is divided into looks like about 4 sections. And the first section is called Tainos. Again, just looking at the bold print, which, lo and behold, it's a key term, right? So Tainos, who or what are they? Well, that little section talks about they are these people that lived on the islands of the Caribbean, the first ones that the Spanish encountered. And it points out that these are relatively simple people living in small tribal groups, living off of, agriculture, not a quote-unquote civilization or complex society by any means. The next subsection is called Spanish Arrival, and of course about the arrival of the Spanish and how what they found was not exactly what they expected to find, and that they were, by most respects, very disappointed. They were looking for wealthy, sophisticated societies with which they could trade and do business. And to be honest, Taino had very little to offer the Spanish. But it points out that the Spanish tried to make the best of a bad situation, and in particular, they first tried to mine for gold, but there really wasn't that much there on those islands, so they switched to agriculture. But of course, to farm you need labor, and most of the Spanish were not prepared to work that hard. They had come to make their fortune and not necessarily to work long, hard hours out in the sun. So they put the Taino to work for them, and they developed a system called encomienda, which again is the third key term on our list for this chapter, and you can find a definition of it up here in the section on page 393 of the book. And I'm not going to go into detail, but it's essentially a system of forced labor where the Taino were put to work for the Spanish, and while the Spanish were theoretically supposed to look after the Taino who worked for them, that really wasn't the case, because again the Spanish were mainly concerned with getting as much as they could, as quick as they could, and often tended to work the Taino to death. But it wasn't overwork or anything, lack of food or other things that were the chief reasons for the decimation of the Taino population. The following section makes it very clear that it was disease, in particular smallpox, that was instrumental in destroying the Taino as a people, really. The Taino, like other Native Americans, had no immunities to European diseases, and so when the Europeans arrived, diseases like smallpox, measles, and so forth swept like wildfire through the population and killed 50, 60, 70, sometimes as many as 90% of the population. And we're going to see that happens in Mexico, Peru, and other parts of the New World whenever the Europeans arrive. The next subsection is called From Mining to Plantation Agriculture. And again, there's no key terms here. So essentially just main theme is the subheading, right? That mining never really panned out for the Spanish. So there was a transition to agriculture. But, the initial efforts of the Spanish weren't terribly successful. However, later on, when other people such as the French and the Dutch and the English come in and take over some of these islands from the Spanish, they switch crops and in particular specialize in sugar. And we're going to see how important sugar became as a cash crop in the Caribbean and also some other parts of the Americas. All right, moving on. The next part of this section deals with what's called the conquest of Mexico and Peru. And in this section, we encounter people known as conquistadors. Many of you have probably heard that word in other settings, and it doesn't take much Spanish to realize that it means conqueror. And that's exactly what Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro were, conquerors. They're essentially soldiers of fortune, military men who came to the Americas looking for wealth and power and honor, glory. In theory, they worked for the Spanish king. They got licenses or special grants to go explore and kind of claim territory. But we'll see that they both essentially disregarded higher authorities whenever it suited their purposes. For example, Cortez, he was sent to Mexico by the royal government, essentially just to make contact with whoever was out there. They weren't quite sure. They heard rumors about these advanced societies, but he was essentially supposed to just kind of explore and establish some connections and report back. Well, when he got to Mexico with his little force, he unloaded all the boats and then burned them, and then told his men that there was no going back. They were essentially going to conquer, create a private empire, or die trying. So that's the type of person Cortez was, and Pizarro was pretty much the same. That, again, these are men who are essentially out for their own welfare, their own wealth. And they're very good at warfare, brutal, ruthless, clever, and they're going to succeed in part because of those characteristics. But we're going to see that once the empires were created, the Spanish government quickly moved to replace them, the conquistadors, with more reliable and trustworthy people. Okay. Cortez, of course, is responsible for conquering the Aztec Empire in Mexico, central Mexico. And if you look at the listed terms, I'm not going to hold it up again. You should know what's coming. That Cortez's name is matched with that of Montezuma, who was the ruler of the Aztec Empire at that time. Just below that, Pizarro is matched with Atahualpa, who was the emperor, the ruler of the Inca Empire down in Peru. So Cortez, Montezuma, Pizarro, Atahualpa, those are the two sides in the struggle. I don't know if you noticed, but I refer to both the Aztecs and Incas as empires. That's important to keep in mind, that the Aztecs had built an empire in central Mexico, largely by conquering other Indian tribes. The Aztecs were certainly not peace-loving, simple people like the Taino. And down in Peru, the Inca had done pretty much the same thing, that they had started as a small group and then slowly but steadily expanded their territory by conquering and incorporating other Indian groups into their empire. And lots of the Indians living under the Aztecs or the Inca were not too terribly happy about that. And one of the things that enabled the conquistadors to triumph, to defeat these large Aztec and Inca empires, was that they were able to find and recruit other Indians to fight with them against the Aztecs and Incas. In particular, the Aztecs were thoroughly hated by many of the people underneath them because, if you know anything about the Aztecs, one of the things they demanded from their subjects, their conquered people, were humans to sacrifice to their gods, often hundreds or thousands at a time. So we tend to see Cortez and Pizarro in the terms of these ruthless, brutal people conquering the Native Americans. But we have to remember that the Aztecs and Incas, in many ways, had done the same thing to other Native Americans just a little while earlier. All right. Now, the conquistadors, there were not a whole lot of them, but they were able to defeat these large Aztec and Inca empires, in large part because they got help from other Indians, in part because they had, of course, more advanced weapons, muskets, horses, iron and steel weapons that gave them a huge edge over the Aztecs and Incas militarily. But the number one reason is the same reason for the destruction of the Taino in the Caribbean: disease. That in both Mexico and in Peru, disease actually killed far more Indians than the Spanish ever did in direct fighting with them. And the diseases undermined the ability of the Aztecs and Incas to put up, really successful resistance. So again, disease is crucial in understanding why the Spanish, just a few Spanish, were able to overthrow these big, powerful empires in the Americas. Never happened over in Asia. Remember, in Asia we had trading post empires that when the Europeans arrived in India or China or other places in Asia, they did not spread diseases. The local people were not decimated by disease, in part, mainly because Europeans and Asians kind of shared the same disease pool, and therefore the Indians or Chinese had, immunities already. So the impact of disease is really crucial in helping recognize why the Americas and later Oceania was different from what happened in Asia, at least in the 15, 16, and 1700s. Now, once the Spanish conquistadors had acquired these territories from the Aztecs and Incas, the Spanish had to govern them, had to rule them. And at first, the conquistadors basically ruled in a kind of haphazard manner, trying to just exploit and extract as much wealth as they could, primarily gold and silver. And the book talks a little bit about the way they did that by taking hostages and threatening them with death if the people did not, hand over the wealth. And sometimes they killed them even after they did. But remember what I said about the Spanish government. They had kind of commissioned the conquistadors to go see what was out there. And once the conquistadors had discovered and then conquered these civilizations, the Spanish government moved quickly to replace the conquistadors with more trustworthy people that they could count on to obey orders and carry out the wishes of the Spanish government back home. They created or tried to create a bureaucratic administration, somewhat similar to what they were creating back home with absolutism. Uh, they dispatched royal governors, and on the list of terms is viceroys. Viceroys were sort of regional governors, representatives of the king in charge of large territories. There were two main parts of the Spanish Empire. Of course, one centered in Mexico, one centered down in Peru and in South America. We don't need to worry about, their respective capitals and all of that. But the viceroys were representatives of the king and were charged with governing these huge territories. And of course, they had a number of assistants and administrative helpers to carry that out. Because the viceroys had so much power and were a long ways from home, the kings had to be very careful to make sure that they did not get ideas of becoming independent or ignoring royal commands. So the Spanish government also created what were called audiencias. And again, you can find audiencias on the list of key terms. And now I'm going to hold up the book again to show you if I can center the picture. Here it is in that section about Iberian empires on page 395. Again, if you're following along, this is where you should highlight those type of things or make notes. The audiencias were essentially courts of law that were supposed to review and supervise the actions of the viceroys and make sure they weren't overstepping their authority or doing anything that violated the rules, the laws issued by the Spanish government back home. Now, after talking a little bit about the Spanish administration in Mexico and Peru, the book moves on and talks about Portuguese Brazil. Now, we've been talking about the Spanish, for what, 20 minutes now, because Spain controlled the vast majority of what we now call Latin America, Central America and South America. But Brazil was the ruler of what is now called Brazil. We don't need to go into details about exactly how that happened, but it ties in with what's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas, that's another key term, and it was essentially a treaty arranged by the Pope, which divided the world outside of Europe between Spain and Portugal, because those were the two countries that had taken the lead in exploring and establishing colonies outside of Europe. And they essentially drew a line, and it just so happened that Brazil lay in the Portuguese half of the world. And the Portuguese really didn't do a whole lot with Brazil to start with. I mean, there were no large empires like the Aztecs or Incas there for them to conquer. So it was kind of hard for them to impose their authority in Brazil simply by knocking over one central authority and replacing them with themselves. And there wasn't a whole lot in Brazil that appeared to be worthwhile to start with. But later on, kind of like in the Caribbean, sugar is going to become extremely important, and then other cash crops like coffee as well. But at the start in the 1500s, early 1600s, Brazil is nowhere near as important economically as the Spanish holdings. All right, and I think we are going to. Before we stop for a minute, it talks. There's something about colonial American society, and again, the idea here is that in the colonies, a very distinct social order, a social hierarchy emerged in which the Spanish conquerors and the settlers occupied the centers of power and wealth, while the Native Americans, those that survived, of course, were clearly at the bottom. and that the Spanish tended to kind of prefer living in urban areas, while the Native Americans were out in the countryside, the rural areas. And it makes a point of trying to highlight how the Spanish in particular saw these new worlds as places to exploit for wealth and power. And many of the people who came really weren't planning on staying. They were going to come, make their fortune, and go back home. At least that was their expectation. It did not always work out that way. In fact, often it did not. So many of them ended up staying for life and their families after that. But this attitude toward the Americas, the author is going to make a point in the next section where it talks about settler colonies in North America, of how the French and English, especially the English, had a very different attitude, and they saw the colonies as a place they meant to settle down and stay, to make a new life for themselves. And that created a different way, a different approach toward running the colonies, toward dealing with the Native Americans who were there. So think about this as a significant difference between the Spanish and especially the English in terms of their views and attitudes toward the New World and their relationships with the Native Americans, and also the difference between the Spanish government and its colonies and the English government and its colonies. Very, very different, as we'll see. But we're going to stop for a second and come back in a little bit and talk about these differences in colonial societies. Okay, I'm back at least for a few more minutes to wrap up this particular lecture. The settler colonies in North America, again, the key there is settler, and how the French and English, especially the English, came and meant to stay. And one of the characteristics of the English settlers in particular was that they came with their wives and families. Most of the people who went to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies were young single men looking to make a fortune. And of course, young single men throughout history have tended to have just a few things on their mind. Wealth is one, sex is the other. And that the Spanish and Portuguese men in the New World often ended up in relationships, marriages, or other arrangements with Native American women, and produced offspring just like Cortez did, and that there was a lot of ethnic, racial, cultural mixing in Spanish America, and even more in Portuguese America, in Brazil, but very little of that in the English colonies. Some in the French, but English people in general had very few relationships with Native American women, again, because they brought their own wives. The section talks about colonial government in these settler colonies, focusing again on England, that a lot of the colonies that were established in North America by the English were essentially private undertakings. We all know about the Pilgrims, and then the early settlers in Virginia. These were essentially private operations undertaken by people who often wanted to get away from the English government. And the colonies in the Americas, the English ones, had a significant degree of autonomy, self-government, that set them apart from the Spanish. There were no such things as viceroys and audiencias and things of that nature in the English colonies. Of course, in theory, they all still answered some way or another to the English government, but the English government never exerted the type of control or tried to exert the type of control that the Spanish government did. And then on 397 as well, it talks about how the relationships with the native population were significantly different in the English colonies. Again, in part because there was no large single empire that controlled all of North America like the Aztecs did in Mexico or the Incas down in the Andes region of South America. And therefore, the English engaged in sort of a continual repeated series of small-scale conflicts with various tribes at different times. So it's sort of a low-grade, ongoing, continual conflict between the English and the Native Americans. And of course, one that will continue for hundreds of years as English or other European settlers move westward and encounter ever new Native American populations. And the book points out that the English at first had a very difficult time, and often the Indians were able to inflict heavy losses on them. But in the last analysis, just like in the Spanish colonies, disease weakened the ability of the natives in North America to put up more effective resistance, and over 100 years or so, the English settlers were able to gain the upper hand, and more English settlers came in, more and more Indians died, and by the end of the 1700s, you had a large number of English settlers and only a handful of Native Americans left. So in the end, the English triumph, but it's in a different way and a little longer process than it was in the Spanish colonies. In a subsequent lecture, we're going to look at the colonial society in the Americas in a little more detail, focusing in particular on what the book calls the multicultural aspect of these colonies, and some of the economic and social manifestations of European rule in these new colonies. But again, that's a story for another lecture, and we'll stop here for today.